Hello, I'm Father Anthony Cicada. Welcome to broadcast number 2 for the Philothea Press bestseller Work of Human Hands, a theological critique of the Mass of Paul VI. To order Work of Human Hands and to read excerpts, visit www.philotheapress.com. Chapter 2, The Liturgical Movement, the Change Agents. Catholic critics of the post-Vatican II Mass reforms generally had the same list of pet peeves about the liturgical changes. A typical roundup of objections against the work of the liturgical reformers might mention replacing Latin with the vernacular, the relentless insistence on vocal participation by the laity, disparaging devotional prayers like the Rosary, arbitrary changes in the rubrics, communion under both species. The list might also include some underlying theological errors, promoting the notion that it is the community which celebrates, reducing the role of the priest to someone delegated by the people, or exaggerating the priesthood of the laity. If you were asked to put a date on that list, you'd probably say the late 1960s. The real date, however, is 1942. The list is taken from a 17-point memorandum that the Archbishop of Freiburg, Germany, sent to his fellow bishops. He wrote it to warn them about the proposals for liturgical changes that were then being widely circulated in Germany and in the rest of Europe. This will surprise most listeners. It certainly surprised me when I first came across the list. Like most conservatives during the post-Vatican II era, I thought that the liturgical revolution got underway only after the Council. In fact, it had already been going on in stealth mode for a long, long time. What about the post-Vatican II practice of inviting everyone up to stand around the altar during the canon, for instance? Youth movement and scout masses in France and Germany during the 1920s. Or Mass facing the people and exchanging handshakes before communion. Klosterneuburg, Austria, again, during the 1920s. Chapter 2 of Work of Human Hands traces the origins of these practices and eventually the roots of the Mass of Paul VI to a phenomenon called the liturgical movement. The movement began in the 19th century as a result of the work of the great Benedictine Dom Prosper Guéranger, founder of the monastery of Salem. The purpose of the movement was to renew fervor for the liturgy among the clergy and the faithful. Its original ideals and initial accomplishments were a great blessing for the Church. In the 20th century, unfortunately, the liturgical movement was hijacked by modernists. Among their errors, considering heretical churches part of the Church, redefining faith as experience and emotion, and neglecting or even denigrating scholastic or Thomistic philosophy and theology. These charges are not merely my personal conclusions, by the way. They are taken from Archbishop Grober's 1942 memorandum. Pius XII intervened with 2 encyclicals that attempted to correct these errors. Mystici Corporis on the Nature of the Church in 1943, and Mediator Dei, 1947, on the Sacred Liturgy. Both clearly restated Catholic doctrine, condemned various errors, and sought to set the liturgical movement back on the right path. The pontiff reiterated these warnings in a 1956 allocution that he delivered to the leaders of the liturgical movement after the International Congress on Pastoral Liturgy. By then, unfortunately, many influential bishops had already embraced the movement's theories and were patiently working to implement its goals. Most would become part of the progressive faction a few years later at Vatican II. Among them was a certain Monsignor Giovanni Battista Montini, who had been celebrating masses for small gatherings of university students, with, as he said, the group praying around the altar. Work of Human Hands also discusses two very influential writers from the pre-Vatican II liturgical movement, whose theories on liturgical reform and the nature of the Mass will resurface in the Mass of Paul VI. The first figure is the Austrian Jesuit Joseph Jungmann. One of his key ideas was the corruption theory, which held that the Mass, as it stood, represented a departure from primitive liturgical ideals. After the Peace of Constantine, it seems, everything in the liturgy was mostly all downhill. Another of Jungmann's ideas was pastoral liturgy. By this he meant refashioning the Mass to meet the perceived needs of contemporary man. The second figure is the French oratorian Louis Bouillet. His 1954 work, Liturgical Piety, lays out two concepts that will become the theological foundation for the Mass of Paul VI. One was assembly theology. This Bouillet used to bypass the Catholic doctrine that the essence of the Mass consists in the sacrifice. Another was Bouillet's invention of other so-called real presences, which Bouillet inflated in order to attack and undermine the Catholic dogma on the real presence. For an analysis of the writings of Jungmann and Bouillet, as well as a history of the liturgical movement, see The Change Agents, Chapter 2 of Work of Human Hands, a theological critique of the Mass of Paul VI. Our next chapter, the creation of the new Mass. To order Work of Human Hands and to read excerpts, visit www.philotheapress.com.